If there is sorcery or bringing life to the dead, etc., this goes without saying it's haram.
Yeah.
And play is permissible, so long as it does not divert one from the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and from one's obligations.
So I would say to avoid it and stay away from it, whether it's haram or not, to play a game in which you're acting like a wizard. Whether it's haram or not, I would advise you to stay away from it.
I never wanted to be a good Muslim, or rather, let me rephrase that, a Muslim that is an idealized, westernized version in which the entire Islamic community is looked at like a monolith.
I'm in Australia, and our Muslim community is very diverse.
My family I grew up charismatic Christian, like the weird kind.
My family is very religious, but my dad is also a huge nerd.
Let's rewind 5 years ago. I was going through a journey as a Muslim, which some might consider ironic since I was born into a Muslim family. But I was, because I believe that Islam should be a journey for each and every individual. And I came across a video on YouTube which was 4 hours in length. I clicked on it, and I believe after that, one aspect of my life was completely changed.
I would like to welcome you to Marquette. The year is 843 PD, or post-divergence. A landmass once marred by a vengeful god during the calamity. The staggeringly twisted mountain ranges created in its wake divided the regions that have now developed into a varied and beautiful continent.
Suddenly, I could create a fictional world in which I wasn't the only inhabitant. I could invite people into that world and experience that world through my perspective, and at the same time create their own perspectives of that world. I talk to people across all time zones in the world, and their opinions and their experiences will be accounted in this video. If there's something that you end up disagreeing with, please keep it limited to this video only. They are very kind people who were kind enough to talk to me. And if you think that, these are all men, well, there are so less Muslims in this space. The number of Muslim women, NBs and trans are even lesser, even some might be even non-existent. Those who want to talk about this in a video, that number is even lesser. There are so few Muslims in this space. So of course, limited viewpoint, but that's what I have to offer. While this was going on, I was going through another journey in which my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was getting mended, which wasn't fractured, but it was thin at best.
Like when you were talking just then, it kind of reminded me of the satanic panic of the 1980s. I know my mother was always worried about it when I was young, and she died at the end of 2023, and one of the last conversations that I had with her, she was talking about she was still worried about it 40 years later.
So you have to understand that recreation isn't prohibited, but it is often frowned upon, especially by the scholars.
Where it really became an issue was in my previous marriage with an Indian woman, actually, and she just thought all sorts of games were a waste of time. She's a doctor and very driven. At that time, I actually got pressured into basically getting rid of most of my collections.
Because you're participating in recreation, you're not doing your religious duty of worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to an extent they are not wrong.
That's where I ran into it, so it actually was, amongst in a Muslim context, it was where that happened. But it wasn't so much the content of it, it was just that, that real strong Hanafi position, games are a waste of time, they're sinful, not even chess kind of thing.
But I also believe that times change, and our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a personal one. It is not something which can be controlled by a scholar or an imam. I'm not trying to create controversy or to create a challenge. I am not. What I'm saying is Allah knows best. See, I assume that I am sinful. All I can hope is to be a better person than I was yesterday.
Fantasy and sci-fi and dealing with that is like, this is a thing that isn't real, it's fine to be doing whatever within it, was always something that I was raised with pretty young, and something that I got used to very young. Like, I was reading Terry Pratchett at like 6 or 7.
The way I ended up getting permission to play Dungeons and Dragons was I wrote an essay that said the Athar. The Athar and Planescape are kind of an anti-religious faction, but only in a D&D term. Their thing is that they treat the D&D gods as just very powerful wizards. They're not gods. They're just very powerful, like, wizards or whatever. Maybe there's a god, but we're not sure. So I wrote a thing and I compared it to Paul's sermon on Mars Hill, where he's like, to the unknown god. And I'm like, obviously, this is D&D saying that, like, their own gods are not gods, so it's fine.
I think my mother would have been a lot more worried if she'd actually looked at the books. You know, we had the AD&D books, you know, like they were full of devils and demons. Whereas my wife, you know, who's very conservative in her own way, she's not concerned about it at all.
Nabil is so to me. I've always considered storytelling and play to be separate from real life while still being informed and shaped by it. So I never had the feeling that what I was doing could be considered sinful. Sin would have to be something unethical, something unjust or cruel or otherwise against God's edicts. Within the confines of a story or a game, no real person is affected directly by the acts or decisions being made. However, within TTRPG, we have the unique aspect of other players who can be affected indirectly by the acts or decisions. In such cases where one is harming someone or someone feels like they are being harmed, there is a possibility of sin, but that is something that's best sorted out by the players between each other.
Keeping the religious theology aside of whether I am considered a good Muslim or not, when I entered this hobby, I found a huge lack of Muslims in this space. And it's not surprising to me. It's not something that would be there in a Muslim household, nor it is something that would be encouraged by a Muslim household. I mean, a game in which you could potentially be playing as a shape-shifting tiefling, that doesn't sound very good, does it? But I also understand that my hobby is separate from my beliefs. My hobby is separate from my faith. My faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is unshaken. No amount of role-playing as a paladin or a cleric can change that.
She's still Muslim, but not conservative. But back then, she didn't approve of the gaming, but it was more just from a secular point of view of it's a waste of time, you know, because she was a doctor and driven. And then as she became more conservative, those kinds of values hardened because she had a religious justification for them.
It's very funny how, like, my Christian people don't expect it, because you see America as like this, oh, it's this liberal paradise, blah, blah, blah. Alabama's not like that. So, like, it was way more conservative in Alabama than it is where I'm living now in the Middle East. Like, it's very surprising to a lot of people. They couldn't stop me from talking about Islam and RPGs. No one can stop me from doing that. I'm way more liberal. So I emailed the sheikh that I follow, and I'm like, listen, I have a very nerdy question. And I lay it out like this. And I'm like, does where power comes from for a D&D character matter for whether it's haram or halal to play? My thinking is I'd been reading some primary source translations of like Al-Kindi, Al-Ghazali, Al-Razi, and one of the things that they talk about is basically determining whether something is licit or illicit by its origin. So I email my sheikh and I'm like, look, I got a question. Is it more haram to play a sorcerer than a druid? And I laid out my reasoning, like different power sources. He's like, I'll get back to you. So he actually assembled like a team of his interns and like made them get D&D books and learn about D&D and read it. And it took like a couple of weeks. He's a very serious guy. And he emails me back and he's like, it's fictional. You can play a necromancer if you want. I was like, all right.
I also believe that it's not sinful to be playing role-playing games. Why? Because it's fiction. You are doing something as a recreation. I mean, like, in that sense, all novels, all fictional novels should be banned. All games should be banned. Everything. Like, half of the things should be outrightly banned. But they are not, because we are living in a different world. With D&D, it's not gambling. I know there's dice roll involved, but it's not gambling because real money and real things are not at stake. You are playing with chance, but in a fictional setting where we use safety tools to be safe, where we make characters in line with what we believe in. I might not want to make a character who drinks, some other person might, That's fine. That's their choice. That doesn't change what I believe in, or that doesn't change my relationship with my faith.
Like I've said before, I'm not here to give my opinion on the jurisprudence nor debate the scholars, because one, I'm not learned enough in these matters to give an opinion which will be backed by evidence and which will be backed by my peers, because again, I am just a Muslim guy who likes to play TTRPGs. I'm just here to talk about how I reconcile myself as a Muslim and as a TTRPG enthusiast.
In almost every game I've ever played where drinking or eating pork is an option, I have refrained, and almost every Muslim gamer I know has refrained. But other aspects really depend on the narrative. Even if we know the characters are not Muslim, some things seem to transcend from player to character, such as drinking or pork, but sometimes the exploration of other kinds of characters, which is something that TTRPGs are excellent mediums for, allow for us to dissect why we take the real life oaths that we take. Do your characters' belief systems line up with the actual gods entities of your setting? These are all themes, motifs, narratives, questions that cannot be tackled without first creating structures within to tackle. In this way, I find it incredibly invigorating to try and show how faith should be pursued and should persist through the medium of TTRPGs.
I mean, I view these things purely as games, and I was definitely turned off D&D, decades ago, when I started to feel that it was just like a genocide game, because you had these species that were inherently evil, so this justified just, slaughtering the entire lot of them. Although I do like the advances that have happened in the hobby where, monsters aren't necessarily evil. So there are some things I can see myself not particularly enjoying just because they're just not me. And I do feel that is to an extent shaped by my sense of ethics and morality. If you think something is wrong, don't do it. You have to be true to yourself. And if you think it's wrong, then don't do it.
It's surprising because when I was a kid, we had like the Satanic Panic stuff. And weirdly enough, I go into the Middle East and it's way calmer. Like no one cares here like they did in the US.
I also got into D&D very young, so I knew it was a nerd thing, and that was why I wanted it, and I convinced my dad to get me and my little brother the 3.5 starter box, and we kind of went from there. Yeah, and so it was early enough that, by the time that would occur to me, I'd already reconciled it, and I'd already, made my calls on there.
When I talked to some people, some of them said that actually their faith and their TTRPG hobby or TTRPG life has been completely separate. There has been no intersection at all, and I agree with that. For some, there might not be any intersection at all. But for me, there was an intersection where at one point I debated whether I should be doing this or not. Whether my duty to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was being affected. Whether it was pulling me away from the responsibilities as a good Muslim and following the sunnah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
I was into fantasy first. I didn't become a Muslim until 2010. My relationship with it is also a bit different. My family I grew up charismatic Christian, like the weird kind.
Then, I've been living in Indonesia for nearly 13 years, and the community, I guess I've been really influenced by the Indonesian attitude. Number one, live and let live, and things that are seen as problematic in other countries aren't seen in the same way, and yet it's quite conservative in its own way. The first woman to have her trans identity affirmed legally in Indonesia, she had support from one of the big ulama of the time, who's from the particular movement that my wife's family was from. Not only was it just accepted, but it was supported by them as something that should happen.
Most of the people who say you should maybe do something else with your life, their concern's more class and economic based, because everyone knows that writers don't get paid well. Rather than that, most of the time, even my more conservative relatives, they go, "Oh, you're basically a video game designer. Video game designing's a job." That's a thing that happens where they don't view it as oh, you're doing something that's potentially haram. They view it as oh, you're basically designing paper video games. that's a job. It's just maybe not a respectable one. Maybe you should go be a doctor or an engineer or go back into psychology.
Just like this is a guide to life, this is another guide, but only limited to the confines of this fictional world. Just like this story has morals and viewpoints and everything, but again, I don't consider this to be the moral compass of my entire being. Not because it was written by a straight white man, but because it wasn't perfect. To me, this is perfect. But then I thought that TTRPGs are just a small part of my life, although it is still a part of my life. My responsibilities as a family man, my responsibilities as an employee, my responsibilities as a creator, those are all separate things. My responsibilities as a Muslim is a spiritual thing. And ever since, I have debated with myself regarding how does my playstyle, how does my world building, and how does my culture affect the thing that I do with TTRPGs, whether it is running games or playing as a character, whatever, how does that affect it? And I've come to two conclusions. One, it has affected how I look at a particular situation, whether it is the good guys or whether it is the bad guys. Secondly, it has affected what kind of PCs that I want to play. Now, for some, it can be categorized as, okay, this person doesn't curse, this person doesn't drink, this person doesn't worship any other god except maybe another god in the fictional world who is the one. For some, it might be different. For some, if the world is based on our real world, then they might be Muslim, they might pray 5 times a day.
A lot of the characters I play, and when I'm a player character, when I'm playing a game, just like I will often write characters who just don't drink, for whatever reason. More often than other people, I will occasionally just make it a character point of this guy drinks water or will not drink alcohol or for whatever reason. If it makes sense for a character or it adds to a scene or whatever, I don't feel too bad about describing a character who does stuff. Like, unlike an actual actor, you don't actually have to drink anything, and you don't have to portray yourself drinking anything. You don't have to ask for, hey, I need this to be a mocktail or whatever.
Again, each person is different. Each Muslim is different. We are not a monolith. Keeping characters aside, let's talk about the community. Let's talk about the TTRPG community. The community itself has people from all walks of life, from all colors of life. Honestly, it's one of the most vibrant and diverse communities if I've ever seen one. And I don't think any other community exists like this. I might be wrong. But the elephant in the room, being queer in Islam is considered sinful. But what happens when you as a player engage with people from that community? Does that shake your belief? Do you shirk them? Do you ignore them? Do you just not talk to them? What do you do? Well, honestly, it's up to the individual. But from what I can say, I've just seen two things from the queer community in this space: curiosity and respect. And before somebody wants to come at me for that, let me just tell you, the queer community is one of the biggest allies of the cause for Gaza and Palestine and all colonized nations and all colonized people in general. You don't even see that from the most liberal countries out there or one of the most free people out there. Why, you might ask? Well, I believe it's because they know what it means to be marginalized, I guess. And in a world which is becoming more Islamophobic day by day, I see nothing but allyship and support and a protest against all of those oppressors. So I'm not gonna hear anything against them at all. And inshallah, may Allah guide us all, and Allah knows best.
Trans people, gay men are right up there with Indigenous people when it comes to supporting us. And so I feel like a bit of a sham in that sense, because my own personal morality is that, everyone deserves to live the way that they want, so long as it doesn't harm others. I'm autistic myself, so I've actually got a very strong affinity for people who are different. I'm really drawn to people that are genderqueer. I see myself in them. And I feel like a bit of a traitor because these are people that I care about and I can advocate for in a broader sense, but within the Muslim community, I find it difficult to advocate for them. And I feel I'm doing them wrong because I don't have the courage to do that. I haven't been willing to be ostracized over it, except the Muslim gamers. The Muslim gamers I'll tell because they're not bothered by it, even if some of them are quite conservative. They won't, it's like they accept that's the world,
I find exclusionary behavior as a cause of concern and anti-Islamic at its core, and would not consider the words of these scholars in this topic worthy of my time. Islamic communities have always been bettered by the involvement of well-meaning others. Even in the Quran, it states that those who do good deeds will receive rewards without exception. Of course, there are better rewards for believers of the books and even better for the believers of the Quran's teaching. But if we were to shun anyone who does good deeds, then we are shunning those whom God will reward. Who would be the bigger fool then?
I've always considered like being respectful to the people around you and being kind to the people around you of paramount importance. I don't know, the people I work with doesn't come up that much when I'm talking with relatives and the like. Definitely when I was looking to get married, one of the things I'd asked people was like, hey, a lot of my coworkers and a lot of my friends are queer. Are you okay with that? And that shut down some conversations immediately, but I got married eventually anyways. It worked out. I found someone for whom that wasn't an issue. If one of my relatives finds out and is angry about it, that's fine. That is a thing I am in position to be willing to risk.
The US is having a much worse time of it because of the friction there. We can all see what's going on in the US right now. It's honestly worse than what's going on over here. I've had queer friends visit me here and it was fine. But in the US, because it's such a focus of the right wing, it's always under attack. There's not a lot of room to just be yourself. The times it does come up here, American media is dominant. So a lot of people here get their stuff from American media and then absorb the culture war aspect without actually being there. I've had people be like, "Oh my God, you're from Alabama? Isn't that overrun with immigrants?" And I'm like, "Dude, you have no clue what Alabama's like. You couldn't overrun it with anything. No one would go there." Keep in mind, I'm in one of the chillest of the Khaliji countries, so.
I've also been battling things which might be construed as Islamophobic or racist towards the Middle Eastern or the Arabic culture or even the Islamic culture. And that's not just in TTRPGs, that's a whole worldwide phenomenon in media, which is why I'm very grateful for this book, The Adventures of Amina Al-Sharafi by Shannon Chakraborty. All the praises that I can think of fall short because one, it's a fantasy adventure based on a fictional version of our real world. And at one point she recites the Ayatul Kursi. Oh my heart.
Okay, this is a surprising influence on D&D. When you read this, you will be shocked that it is not a D&D Appendix N book. It is basically kind of a hoax that was done by Pakistani and Indian writers in the 1800s, where they basically wrote modern fantasy in the 1800s, but they came up with a way to trick people into thinking it was from the Mughal era. And the gimmick is that sorcerers are creating talismans, little mirror universes where magic is more powerful. And they have to break into them and kill the sorcerer that's powering the artificial world. And this is written in the 1800s. And it's got a lot of proto-D&D stuff in it. It's got Amar the AR has a hat that when he puts it on, he can look like anyone. He's got a bag that can fit in any amount of treasure. He can fit anything in his bag. They get magical items from magical bow and arrow, magical armor. It's very D&D flavored, but it's straight out of the subcontinent. It rocks. They do this common thing that RPGs try to do, which is they totally misunderstand how to put Islam in an RPG, and instead of going for the religious aspect, what they do is they just have a character that's a prophet, and then everything else is the same. You see that in Al-Qadim, you see it in Legends of the Five Rings. they actually put out an Arabian expansion called Legends of the Burning Sands. And it's the same thing. It's like, oh, they're still pagans, but this time they got a prophet. The best example of Islam in an RPG book. I will go to bat for this forever. Shadowrun 3rd edition, Loose Allegiances. And it's got several chapters on the Islamic world. It sets up this awesome plot. In Shadowrun, it's kind of a sequel to Earth Dawn. And the gimmick of Earth Dawn is post-apocalyptic fantasy where like Cthulhu-type horrors are coming in. And people are coming out of vaults. And so in Shadowrun, one of the horrors gets in this guy and basically kind of turns him into Dajjal. And so that's the overarching plot for like the Muslim characters. But the way they do it is Shadowrun books were written as in-universe documents, like pages from a BBS that would then be commented on by characters, right? So they basically have what a BBS post about the state of Islam, the state of the Middle East, but then they have like 8 Muslim characters that are commenting on it as posters. And they're not all the same kind of Muslim. They have different opinions. They get into arguments. And it's like the exact kind of discussions you would see on a real message board. Like, they nailed it. It feels like what Muslims would say if they were in Shadowrun. Because they didn't try to portray Islam as one overarching thing. There's a lot of RPGs that try to do stuff interesting with Islam, but D&D never really gets to that point. So there's certain aspects of American TTRPG culture that like do end up being super Islamophobic in really funny ways. Because the thing is, if you're Islamophobic in a TTRPG context, you don't really have a lot of victims. Like, you're taking a swing, but there's not a lot of people to hit with it.
I think it's largely a reach thing. There are very few Muslim people in the industry here. And there are very few Muslim people in the industry here. Most of the ones I know are Desi. Even at some of the most diverse tabletop RPG spaces in the industry, there'll be maybe 3 or 4 other people at a full convention who are Muslim that I am aware of. There just are never very many people.
So while this does not affect my faith, this does affect how I want my TTRPGs to be.
There are often creative decisions I'm making where I'm going, is there a different way I want to handle this in line with how I want to perceive, like how I want to portray people and how I want to portray things? I know I've been told a couple of times that my writing often comes off as like prudish because I don't really want to write about like particularly explicit stuff, and I'll often like reflexively decenter romance or similar things in my writing because it's not something that like that is one of the things that like growing up I never really acclimated to.
TTRPGs are a medium in which stories are not only told but participated in. It's a unique form of play that involves your imagination, your friends, and a world that could never exist. All the real life rules of respecting other people, thinking critically of the things that you are told that you do, working together and growing as people still apply, no matter what the imaginary characters of your sheet of paper are doing. You, as the player, are Muslim, and that doesn't change from creating your first character to rolling the last dice of the campaign.
I believe this hobby is worth exploring for anyone. Doesn't have to be Muslim, doesn't have to be Christian, doesn't have to be Hindu. It does not matter, honestly. And if nothing else, it puts you in the shoes of another, makes you see different perspectives, and learning for oneself is encouraged in Islam. So I guess I'll just leave it at that. I have to go have iftar, and I'll see you in the next video.